So welcome. I hope everybody has enjoyed and found today productive. Our final event for the day is the plenary, and I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Dr. Emma Stokes, who is the Vice President for Global Field Conservation at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Emma has many years of experience working across both Africa and Asia before taking on her current role overseeing 13 regional programs in over 60 countries around the world. But perhaps her most impressive qualification is her founding role in the SMART partnership. Emma was one of the first people who in the room when SMART was created, and was a real champion for and major player in the creation and initial development and rollout of SMART at a lot of places around the world. So it's great that she's able to be here. I would be remiss if I didn't say that Emma was one of the people early on who said SMART didn't need a mobile app and that everything should be recorded on paper. But she, I think, came around to the idea that eventually mobile data collection was a good idea, right, Emma? So yeah, welcome, Emma, and thank you for joining us here.
So thank you very much, Rich, for that lovely anecdote and introduction. Hi, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today. I'm really happy to have been invited to give this speech today. I'm not a technologist. I'm a guerrilla biologist by training. I'm a conservationist by trade, but I am a real believer in the role of conservation technology in biodiversity and nature conservation. I'm an avid user, if not regular. So that's the perspective I'm going to be bringing to this presentation today. So it's also a bit of a personal journey, as Rich said. I was involved right from the beginning with SMART, with those early discussions in sort of 2010. I couldn't actually find a photo from 2010, so this is actually from 2014, I think, at one of the steering committee meetings in Ngorongoro National Park in Zimbabwe. But many of the people at this steering committee are still heavily involved in SMART today, which is fantastic. I'm not personally involved on a day-to-day basis anymore, although WCS is still very, very committed to SMART and the SMART partnership. But it has been involved in SMART for many, many years, has really informed a lot of my opinions on conservation technology more generally. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is a little bit about SMART, but more broadly about conservation tech. And it's been very influential in my thinking about how conservation tech is applied, how it's scaled, how it's used. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history there, a bit about some of the results I've seen through our work with WCS programs, and a little bit about sort of my thoughts for the future for SMART, but also conservation technology more broadly. For anyone who sat through the plenary this morning and saw Rich's opening presentation, there's only a few slides that are similar to that. My slides are obviously better. But I think that is just reinforcing some really critical points that will come out from a lot of the things that Rich said this morning as well, and a few new things as well. So just perhaps to start, a reminder of kind of why SMART was born back in the day in 2011, I guess, was when it was launched. And, really, this was a small group of people. Most of those people were kind of working on the front lines of conservation and were experiencing some of the day-to-day challenges. And really, it was a sort of a realization of the need for data-driven decision-making in conservation. And, the sort of frustrations when data wasn't available, informed decision-making wasn't available, or it wasn't in the hands of those people who most needed it at that time. It was also driven by the realization at the time that there were a few tools available for this kind of thing, but that those tools were not quite able to fully scale and adapt to the needs that we had, but they gave us enough of a glimpse into what might be possible if we had a tool that could rise to the challenge. So, it was developed, and this is still a key factor today, by those first-hand needs that I mentioned, but also the realization of other factors. There was a very heavy focus on the needs for law enforcement and protected areas at the beginning, But also just this sort of realization that, rangers were doing a really difficult job. It was often hugely undervalued. Rangers were poorly motivated. There was very little information available with which to sort of improve their work, provide feedback on their work. And also the data that we needed was only accessible to a very small number of people. So that sort of just reinforced a little bit some of the rationale for why we needed it. There was an initial focus on protected areas when SMART was first developed, and that's still a big factor today, even though SMART is now being used obviously in a wide variety of different kind of conservation contexts and by a number of different actors. The main reason why we really sort of honed in to protected areas is that these are areas that have got goals, objectives, operational structures. They've got mandates that fully provide for effective data-driven decision-making, but that with the exception of a few pretty well-funded protected areas, this was largely just not happening. So we wanted to be able to both improve that situation, but also to use that information to make a really solid case for investing in protected areas and in conservation, and to really sort of drive some accountability in that investment and decision-making. And, so going back to Rich's point that I kind of poo-pooed the idea of mobile technology, bear in mind at the time, this was sort of 2009, this was just at the beginning, really, of the kind of mobile smartphone revolution, right? So fortunately, there were people like Rich who were more foresighted than me that were like, no, this is going to take off, it's going to be a big thing, we need to fully embrace it. And of course, that was correct, and really I knew that all along, and yeah. So that was another big factor in this sort of, building motivation and valuing the work. So in 2011, the SMART Partnership was born. It's had some changes to its core membership of the partners, but pretty much it's had this sort of core subset of partners who've been supporting it all along. Obviously the value of SMART is less its partners, but more its enormous user base. And the role of the partners really was to sort of assume this collective responsibility to oversee the tool development, its application, its uptake, and that bringing in and feeding back from that user community. And that, that remains the core mission to this day. Rich put this slide up this morning, but I can't really overestimate this enough because it's probably the single most important kind of set of ingredients, I think, to sort of success of SMART and probably conservation tech more generally. From the get-go, we put sort of equal emphasis on these three pillars of both technology, the user community, and incorporating the role of the user community, but also capacity building. And I do think that those are the three single most important ingredients of any sort of successful scaled conservation technology product, perhaps in addition to sort of sustainability, which I'll come back to in a little bit. So again, you've sort of seen this a little bit probably throughout the day. SMART sort of started out as a kind of core data collection tool, very focused on improving wildlife protection, very focused on being in the hands of rangers. It's obviously, I'm sure you've heard this through the course of the day and will continue to hear it. It's obviously evolved in its functionality over time. It's added on these new modules for surveys, for intelligence-led work, for human-wildlife conflict. But I think one thing that's been really key is, and this has been partly the role of the partnership, in that it's stayed very, very true to its core principles, which have guided that new functionality. Like if you imagine you've got a user base of sort of 1,200 sites, everyone has a specific need. I want it to do this. I want it, I want it to do this. I want it, to make a cup of tea. I want it to do all of this. I want it to look at this, and all these things. So, I think in sort of investing in the evolution of the software, we've been really focused on a few core principles. Firstly, it has to be in the hands of those who are using it on the front line. So it's got to be open source, and it's got to be free, and it's got to be accessible. Secondly, it's got to work in a variety of environments that suit these frontline conservation needs, which often are offline and disconnected environments. We don't want to replicate existing technology. We don't want to recreate the next, sort of ArcGIS, but we do want to evolve it in such a way that it makes some of that core functionality more accessible to the users that are using it. And, we want to be able to continually invest in it so that it doesn't become obsolete within a few years, keeping it relevant, facilitating broader adoption. And finally, we want to ensure it can scale. And this is sort of the critical thing of not going down too many niche roads. Like, if someone would come to the partnerships of saying, well, we really wanted to do human-wildlife conflict, it would be a discussion about, okay, well, how can we add that module where it could be used? It brings new functionality that could be used to assess human-wildlife conflict, but could be used for a variety of other things. And that's a little bit like the profiles or the intelligence is now being used for a lot of just general entity tracking. So I think that's always been a core feature, and it makes it stay true to its core principles and core mission. I think Rich said this morning, and I'm going to say it again. I think when we started out, we didn't really have a target. I think we thought about 100 sites or something like that. Obviously, we've seen it a few times. It's now in over 1,200 sites, more than 80 countries. A lot of those countries have now adopted it. We heard the example of Namibia this morning, have adopted it across their entire national park networks, which is something that we're very proud of. And there's continuing to be new uses, new user bases, new geographies that are constantly being added. And I think this just speaks to the massive need that was out there for this kind of information. Again, we've talked a lot about how sort of that original focus on protected areas, it's now scaled, it's now being used in a variety of contexts, it's being used by community-based groups, it's being used by the private sector, it's being used across terrestrial and marine realms, it's been used by protected area agencies, by NGOs, by local civil society organizations, by researchers, has a very broad use, but it stayed very true to that sort of core mission of data-driven conservation decision-making and conservation outcomes. That's, it's still very true to its core goals. And again, the types of monitoring that we're doing have also really evolved. This is just an example of guerrilla health monitoring that's now being used to monitor the impacts of tourism on great apes. So it has a sort of broad range, very holistic kind of conservation portfolio of approaches in protected areas and outside protected areas. So, 10 years down the road, and I want to say, well, 12 years down the road, I want to say a little bit about some of the impacts of SMART. And these are probably from my own experiences and some of the projects that I've been involved with in some way, shape or form with WCS. And I want to talk a little bit about some of those kind of qualitative impacts that are hard to really put a number around, but which, you all feel at the site. And then some quantitative impacts too from some of the longer running success stories that we've been fortunate enough to be part of. I think just on that sort of qualitative and side of it, so this whole premise of the tool being in the hands of those that were using it and being able to sort of value the work and see the results of the work, I think this has been really quite striking, across protected areas. When rangers can see what they're doing, when that work is being valued, when there's sort of, substantial feedback in response to that, and indeed anyone who's working at the front line of conservation. There's something very kind of rewarding and gratifying, and it adds value, and it goes a long way in these very difficult situations. It also provides, at its core, it provides information which can then lead to decisions. And what we're seeing now, there's sort of an in-house analysis and reporting function, obviously, but, over time, SMART can then lend itself to deeper and longer-term analyses that can inform, a variety of applications. I think where we were talking yesterday, we're now sort of shifting, certainly in our own organization, we're shifting from calling jobs SMART focal points more to sort of analysts, because those individuals are doing a broad range of analytical work of which SMART data is now feeding into. And it really is contributing to this sort of process of holistic adaptive management. Thirdly, it's an effective communication tool. When you have information and you have data and you have maps and you can show what's going on, it's an extraordinarily effective communication tool. And I think this is one of the things that we saw really at the outset, where we were just kind of talking to protected area agencies or government agencies and showing them, what was going on or what was not going on in those protected areas. And that provides a very valuable feedback loop in investing in those areas. I've never done, an analysis of how this might have generated funding or accountability for protected areas, but I'd be interested to see it. I also want to give a couple of kind of more quantitative, longer-term examples of how SMART and conservation tech more broadly have contributed to some real conservation success stories. I want to be very clear here that SMART or conservation technology, it's not a silver bullet. It's definitely not going to be solely responsible for saving a species or recovering a species. But if it is fully integrated as part of a holistic conservation package, it has an extraordinarily important role to play, particularly in the case of SMART, because it's data-driven and it provides information. And fundamentally, information is power and can lead to all sorts of effective decision-making if used wisely within the appropriate structure. So firstly, I just want to give an example on tigers. In 2007, I joined our WCS tiger team in Asia, and it was the start of a very ambitious project that we launched together with between WCS and Panthera at the time to recover tigers across their range. It was a 10-year project. And, I was told at the time, tigers, the data was coming out, not in a good way, numbers declining. I was told at the time by a bunch of tiger experts, of which I was not one, that this is straightforward. You focus on protecting a source site of breeding tigers, the prey populations will rebound, and then over some time, the tiger populations are going to recover. And I was like, okay. And then, if you look at sort of what's happened, that's kind of what's starting to happen. We're sort of maybe like 10, 15 years down the line. This is just data from 7 sites across 5 countries where WCS has been working, but there are many other examples. So, it sort of bore out what the strategy was, kind of worked. And these were some of the places that WCS first established SMART. I think they were like the pilot sites back in 2011, 2012 of the initial version of SMART, and we had sort of some initial trainings together with the SMART partnership in Asia. And again, I think the reason why it was so critical was it was a key piece in completely rebooting the entire patrolling system and wildlife protection system in these protected areas. And in many of these areas, there hadn't really been much focus. People were sort of wandering around. There wasn't, an awful lot of information or feedback or adaptive management. And, the SMART tool just provided this tangible thing with which we could just start an entire conversation about rebooting the protected area systems. So, and I want to give an example, and many of you will have seen this example. This is from the Western Forest Complex in northwest Thailand. WCS has been working there with the Department of National Parks for many, many years. This just shows a graph of increasing patrol coverage measured through SMART, over the last sort of 16, 17 years. I want to emphasize the goal here wasn't just to walk as much as possible and just to increase that effort. The goal here with SMART was to provide information on our information gaps. We wanted to identify where those gaps were, we wanted to close those gaps, and then once we had all that information, we would then be able to prioritize the patrols in those areas where they were most needed. And this is subsequently, this kind of information has subsequently been combined with much deeper analysis, looking into sort of, crime science and problem-oriented policing, which I'm sure people are talking about during this Congress. But it starts fundamentally with data and information, without which you're operating completely in the dark. And, as a result of that, poaching, patrol effort increased in the right places, which is the key thing, and poaching reduced. And, the result in Western Forest Complex is just a phenomenal tiger recovery success story. Tiger populations there now have rebounded by 60%. And look, I'm not naive. There are political, there are institutional factors that all feed in here. It requires kind of a minimum level of investment of resources. But this is a particularly good example, but it's not the only example. There are other examples like this. So I also want to, just shift a little bit to another example in Northern Republic of Congo. It's a site that I've sort of had a long history with. I started my conservation career here, so I've always been a little bit biased and interested in following the evolution of this site. And so this site, Northern Republic of Congo, is maybe 25% of Africa's remaining forest elephants. It's a really important area. And, in 2010, 11, 12, it was engulfed, as was much of the African continent, in this massive wave of elephant poaching. And anyone who's worked in Africa over the last sort of 10, 15 years will remember this, because it fundamentally changed the way in which we do conservation, and it fundamentally sort of changed the way we approach dealing with an extremely acute and extreme and large threat in the region. And again, a little bit like the tiger example, but perhaps a bit more acute, is that our approach to it, and again, it wasn't just about conservation technology, but our approach was very data-driven. It was all about identifying those information gaps, filling those information gaps, and then using that information in the most sort of effective, targeted way. So, first of all, we had to close those knowledge gaps. And this doesn't maybe illustrate it quite as impactfully as the Thailand example, but again, this wasn't really about just walking more and doing more. This was about understanding what we knew, understanding what we didn't know, closing those information gaps, and then making decisions about where to dedicate resources and where to focus effort in those places where it was most needed. And this was combined with a whole suite of different approaches that we used, including a very strongly intelligence-driven approach on ivory trafficking in urban centers, obviously an increase in investment, but this data-driven aspect of it was critical in focusing that effort in the places it was needed. And remember, too, this was happening really in real time. This was a very fast-moving situation and an extremely large and acute problem that we were all experiencing. So over time in Indoki, 2018, this is showing like a poaching indicator and the numbers of poached elephant carcasses that were found inside the park and around the park. The peak was in sort of 2018, 19. I'm not sure if that was the peak of poaching or that was just the peak of our information. I think at that point we had all the information we needed and were able to really sort of, adequately address the situation. And we were able to adequately address it quite quickly once we were aware of what was happening and what was going on. And the result, I think, 2023, Ben, right? First year with no poached elephants inside the national park, which we're very, very proud of. Yeah. So, this particular response to elephant poaching, so it did require something additional to what SMART was able to provide at the time. It required rapidity and speed of response. Just to sort of emphasize again, this was an acute problem that was escalating very rapidly. And, during this period, across many places in Africa, hundreds of elephants were being poached in a matter of days. So it was a very fast-moving situation. And, the need for real-time operational response, that's a real need. And that was something that, we needed. At the time, EarthRanger wasn't around, it was just being developed. I don't think Smart Connect certainly wasn't around. I think, we sort of fashioned something together with Google Earth, and it served those purposes, but it really was a real need for these acute situations. And there are many other examples where it's a real need. We're dealing right now with WCS in firefighting in Central America and in the Amazon. These are like real needs that need very fast-moving operational responses. So this sort of shifts a little bit to talk about the current landscape of conservation tech, how that's evolving, how the needs are evolving, and how our approach, both as a conservation and a conservation tech community, needs to evolve to meet some of those needs. So, the last decade has been an incredible period of innovation in conservation technology. WCS, this is just a few products that WCS has been, the privilege to be a partner on or involved in their development. I emphasize partner. It's a journey that's involved a number of folks who are in this room right now, and will continue to need a highly collaborative approach. For like wildlife protection, wildlife monitoring, social science, even like monitoring coral reefs, which is the mermaid tool at the bottom right, people have got access to tools and functionality that they never had like 10 years ago, or they couldn't have dreamed of 10 years ago. So, I think this presents a phenomenal shift in the landscape in which SMART is operating and we're operating, but also obviously presents, phenomenal opportunities. If we look, I've already been told this graph is wrong, so don't pay too much attention to it. But if we look at, SMART deployments globally over the year, of course, we've seen a massive uptick. We're continuing to see an increase, and but obviously at some point that's going to level off, right? That's just normal. That's how things work. We'll continue to increase and add new sites. And then, focus shifts to making sure we support the existing sites, but also evolving to meet functionality and evolving needs of those sites. So I sort of see the next 10 years focusing much more on this integration function of SMART, which sits in the middle of this evolving conservation technology landscape. And I do see this sort of focus shifting a bit to integration with other technologies at sites in which it's operating. So I'm not going to try and explain this map of things, which has kind of come out of Jonathan Palmer's head, who's our CTO of SMART, but I do fundamentally agree with the premise of it, and I can try and explain what I think it represents, which I suspect will not be new to many of you. If you look at the trajectory of conservation technology from my kind of simplistic way of looking at it, it starts from individual applications, then it's moved to fully supported platforms like SMART, of course, and like EarthRanger. And now I think, we're shifting. What we don't want to do is sort of go backwards and have sort of independent applications and independent platforms everywhere. We're now shifting to sort of really promoting and actively enabling this integration between these platforms. We're talking about bringing together the relative strengths of these platforms, be it data management, real-time sensor data display, reporting or analysis, or mapping for fit-for-purpose integrations at individual sites, where the whole of this is far greater than the sum of its individual parts. And for that, we're obviously going to have to work together as a community on these issues to fully harness and maximize the potential and be able to respond to user needs. So there are some challenges to realizing this big vision. Internet connectivity, electricity provision, it's improving, but it still remains a big challenge, and it still does remain an obstacle to many protected areas around the world. There are still some imbalances around the world on access to internet and electricity provision. But there are increasingly solutions coming available that really start to offer kind of affordable internet connectivity solutions. And I know many protected areas now looking to things like Starlink to just provide fairly affordable, fairly effective internet connectivity that just allows a whole new level of functionality of conservation technology. So, we are still continuing to face very real challenges in protecting nature, in recovering nature, in restoring nature. In many places the world really is on fire. I've talked a lot about fire management, but because it's really sort of front and center in my mind. In the Amazon last year, we had many of our teams were sort of refocused on addressing this issue. And in Central America right now, we're entering into the fire season, and it just requires everyone to stop what they're doing and shift to fire management. And we're in an El Nino year, so it's going to be particularly more dramatic. And of course, there's climate change, so these things are going to become increasingly more challenging for us. But at the same time, I think, and this is not just conservation tech. I'm talking about just I don't think I've ever known a more enabling environment globally to sort of move forward the agenda of nature conservation. Many of you have heard of 30 by 30. It's a big initiative. It's definitely a hot button topic right now in global policy. And perhaps, many of you, understandably, perhaps pay less attention to global policy, but it's important because global policy determines national government priorities, and it provides a real inroad and leverage point for us to really sort of move forward what we want to do, for conservation and the sites that we care about and that we're working in. 30 by 30, quote is just taken from the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. 100 governments have signed up for this, and a whole bunch of NGOs and organizations, many of your organizations may well be signed up to it. We certainly are. And yes, it's about creating new protections, but it's also about doubling down on improving effective management of those existing protected areas. And there's a lot of global interest politically and a lot of donor interest in this right now. And I think it is a real moment. We've only got 6 years until something else will happen, but it's a real moment to capitalize upon this and build on that momentum. Conservation tech really has a role to play in this kind of movement. But for that, we do need to sort of come together as a community, really focus in on these integrations and really focusing on sharing resources and sharing goals to really be better than our, to be better than our sort of individual roles. Just within WCS, we've on this note, we've been discussing about setting up and establishing a network conservation tech hubs around the world in some of the sites we're working in. So these are kind of model cases of integrated technology, showcasing and evaluating technology, driving innovation, driving R&D, but also providing training grounds, exchange programs where people can kind of come and learn. And, the goal really would be that this would transcend organizational boundaries. This would transcend individual, platform boundaries. I was reading the SMART annual report, and I was really happy to see these sort of SMART demonstration sites. And I think, we could lift that up and have these sort of integrated tech demonstration sites that kind of almost transcend individual platforms, but are building on the strengths of those individual platforms in individual sites. I think that would be a really great goal, certainly from my perspective. And I think SMART is really centrally placed in driving those integrations. I just saw the tail end of the last presentation where that's exactly what was being proposed. So I very much look forward to coming back next year to the Conservation Tech Conference to see how we've built on all of this momentum that we've already generated. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Emma. I hope that today was useful for everybody. Definitely some valuable insights in Emma's presentation and some good perspective on both the past of SMART and the future of SMART and conservation technology in general. Just a few housekeeping items. So the next official event at 5:30 is the cocktail hour and a half. So we invite everybody here to join us for that. You should have cocktail tickets in your badge, and that will be starting at 5:30 just outside here. Unfortunately, because of the rain, we had to move it indoors, so it'll be just in the hallway out here. Followed by, for those who are staying at the hotel, dinner at 7 o'clock. A reminder to everybody, if you're speaking tomorrow, to please upload your presentations at the speaker and media room, which is just off the main hallway here. There's a sign outside the door. It makes things much, much easier to keep the sessions on time. And with that, I will close the proceedings for the day. Thank you all for all your contributions and for taking the time and to travel here, and look forward to seeing you for a drink this evening. Thanks.